The attack by the 2nd Ranger Battalion on Pointe du Hoc was one of the great faits d'armes of the D-Day landings. The Rangers had been formed in 1942 by training with the British Commandos, who had been formed in 1940 by Churchill. But what was La Pointe du Hoc?
This is a barrel of the type of gun that was here. But they're French-made Schneider guns, made in the First World War in 1917. And then the French had them on the Maginot Line. So when Germany invaded France, they took them off the Maginot Line. There were several of them. They took them up to Boulogne in case Britain tried to attack across the Channel. And then in 1942, when they started the Atlantic Wall, they brought 6 of them here to form this gun battery at Pointe du Hoc, which was here to cover the estuary of the Vire and the Douvre. So it could fire on Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. These guns had a range of 12 miles, which is why the ships bringing the men in stayed 12 miles out, so that these guns couldn't hit them, and that meant the men had to come in 12 miles in the Higgins boats in 4-foot waves. Now this turntable would be in the middle of the gun emplacement, and it's been thrown over here by the bomb that hit that gun pit. Now this would be up the other way. Those wheels would turn on a disc, and there'd be a spindle in the middle of the gun pit, keeping it in place. So the turntable we saw over there would be on top of that spindle, and those wheels would turn on that disc. So they could turn the gun roughly, then they'd have the wheels, 2 wheels on the gun, one for turn the barrel 15 degrees each way, and the other for the elevation. So the gun could turn 360 degrees. Now that wasn't much of an advantage because the guns were here far out to sea to cover the Vire estuary, which is over there between here and Utah Beach. And the big disadvantage was no protection. So that's why they decided to make the casements. Rommel decreed that all big guns should be in casements to protect them. The gun battery consisted of 6 of these circular gun pits, and they were controlled by a fire control position on the headland. There was also bunkers for housing the men and ammunition. 2 of the 4 casements that they were building were finished. There was also 2 anti-aircraft gun emplacements with 37mm guns in, and many machine guns in Tobruk's, and also there were trenches along the top of the cliffs with men in. This bunker was the hospital or aid centre, the normal T-shaped entrance, the machine gun opposite. The ventilation system would have been here to bring air in. Machine gun here to protect the entrance. The stove would be here for heating. There's the duct. And the second room. There were 2 anti-aircraft gun emplacements at Pointe du Hoc. This is one. There was a 20mm anti-aircraft gun, but when this place was bombed, the bombers were often flying too high for these guns, and so there was an 88mm gun next to it, just placed on the ground. The other anti-aircraft position is in the distance there, with the gantry on top. That's the far side of the gun battery. Between being started in 1942 in 1944, this site changed quite a bit. Those were the first ammunition stores, just corrugated iron, covered in earth. This is just curved corrugated iron with earth over the top. This was an ammunition store. Sometimes they made troop shelters like this, like you can see at WN 62 on Omaha Beach.
The first shelters were pretty rudimentary, and then they made shelters for the ammunition and the men out of concrete with 8-foot thick roofs.
So one of these rooms would be for machine gun bullets, and the other one for the shells. In the summer they have sheep on the site to keep down the grass. Looks like they've been in here for some shelter. These doors weigh 500 kilos.
Quite a few of the bunkers at Pointe du Hoc are accessible. This one was for non-commissioned officers. The entrances to bunkers are always T-shaped, so you can never fire directly into them, and you don't know which way to turn once you go down the steps. Just like in the other bunker, there's the ventilation system, the machine gun port, and the outlet for the stove for heating. The bunks are hooked onto these bars on the wall. You see, there could be 3 levels, but because this was for NCOs, just 2 levels are used, and the bunks will be hooked up onto the ceiling into those hooks. In that room, there'd be a periscope that they could push up to see what was happening above ground. These personnel bunkers always had a tow brook on top of them for close protection. A man could stand in here with a machine gun.
This was a reservoir for holding water for firefighting, washing, making concrete. It's been broken by the bombing. There's one at the Hillman bunker behind Sword Beach, which is intact. Now, because the circular gun pits didn't give any protection over the top of the gun, they were building these casements. They're going to build 4 of them, but they only managed to build 2. One was started and the other one wasn't even started. Now, the guns they had here couldn't have gone in these casements, because where they were in those pits, they were on a turntable, because they were field guns, and if they were in a casement, they'd need to have a flat floor. Now, there's a big hole here, and this is designed for ship's guns, just like is a long gun battery, though they would have been smaller, because these casements are smaller than the ones at Long. So I don't know where they expected to get them from. This is as far as the 3rd casement got. There's just the rebar in place, and they started building the wall of blocks, and that's as far as they got. They abandoned it. Now, just here is what looks like a pile of boulders, but is in fact the cement bags that were left here, and the paper's disappeared, and the cement's gone rock hard. And this little mound was a pile of gravel. All that was here ready to make the concrete for this casement that never got finished. You can see here they started building the wall of blocks. They did that instead of making a form of wood. And here is the rebar.
Now, on the headland is the fire control position, where they'd have the rangefinder. So they get the range to targets, but they couldn't send the information directly to the guns, because the guns could be 200 or 500 or even more distance away, and so the information wasn't correct. So they'd have to telephone down to the map room underneath, where they do mathematical conversion, and then they could telephone to the guns. Of course, all that took time, so if a ship is moving, it's gone. And that's why the warships came in closer than the ships unloading the men, because the warships are moving and the ships unloading the men were static. Now, if you want a detailed description of this bunker, you should watch the video by Geert van den Bogaert, made under the auspices of the American Battle Monuments Commission, and the link is in the information. Now, these craters were made mainly by 500-pound bombs. The whole gun battery was bombed at least 6 times, twice in April, twice in May, and twice in June. So that's what the Rangers had to contend with. But who were the Rangers? The Rangers were the American commandos, based on the British commandos. The British commandos was an idea of Churchill. When Britain got out of Europe through Dunkirk, Churchill thought that if we can't fight the Germans with an army in Europe, we could have small bands of highly trained men to go and wreak havoc against different targets. When the US joined the war in 1942, the Rangers, the Special Forces, were formed by training with the British commandos. One of their first actions was taking part in the fateful raid on Dieppe on the 19th of August 1942. One of the 2 Rangers killed in that action is buried in the cemetery at Omaha. So what was the plan? 2 battalions of Rangers took part in D-Day, the 2nd and the 5th. The companies D, E and F of the 2nd Rangers were to assault Pointe du Hoc. Company C was to assault the cliffs at the western end of Omaha Beach to attack WN-73, then continue to Pointe du Hoc. The 5th Rangers, plus companies A and B of the 2nd, were to go into Pointe du Hoc as reinforcements after the successful attack at Pointe du Hoc, otherwise go into Omaha Beach. The Rangers were to leave their troop ships at 4:30 to start the 12-mile journey in the British LTAs, which would take 2 hours. While they made their way towards the cliffs in 4-foot waves, the battleship Texas would fire at the battery, forcing the German troops to take cover. The Rangers would arrive at the foot of the cliff at 6:30 as the Texas stopped its bombardment. The Rangers would use grappling hooks fired by rockets to hook onto the barbed wire on top of the cliffs. The grappling hooks had ropes attached to them, which would allow the Rangers to scale the cliffs. They also had 2 ducks with London Fire Brigade ladders on. A duck is spelt D-U-K-W and was an amphibious truck. The ladders would extend up to the height of the cliffs, and 2 machine guns mounted on top would fire on the cliff top. So the Rangers would get up the cliff before the Germans could recover from the bombardment of the Texas. That was the plan, and of course nothing went to plan on D-Day. The same current that affected Utah Beach and Omaha Beach pushed the Rangers off course. They weren't heading for this headland or that headland, but the next headland. They didn't actually land, but Colonel Rudder, who led them, realized they're going the wrong way. They changed course but lost 40 minutes. The Texas, following the original plan, stopped firing at 6:30. The German troops then had 40 minutes to recover and emerged from their bunkers to see the Rangers coming along parallel to the coast, being fired at before they landed and having to climb the cliffs against gunfire and grenades. Shells were attached to the ropes hanging down the cliff. The Germans just had to cut the rope to send the shell crashing down the cliff face. In spite of all of this, the 1st Rangers were at the top within 15 minutes. The rocket-powered grappling hooks didn't work as well as hoped. They tended to be fired early from the landing craft. The landing craft had been swamped by 4-foot waves, and the ropes were soaking wet and heavy. Those fired from the beach worked better, but they could slip off the barbed wire or be cut by the Germans. But 2 things helped them get up. The captain of the destroyer Satterley saw the Rangers had problems and brought his ship in as close as possible to bring the destroyer's guns to fire on the cliff top. A British destroyer, the Taliban, did the same thing. During one of the early bombing raids, a bomb had hit the edge of the cliff by the eastern anti-aircraft gun emplacement. This caused the cliff to collapse, leaving a pile of rubble, then a slope instead of sheer cliff. This was noted on the maps the Rangers had. Once the 1st Rangers reached the summit, they then had the advantage over any German troops in the open. Each group of Rangers had an objective, but they were dismayed to find the gun pits empty. They'd done all that for nothing. The guns had been moved at the end of April, over a month earlier. During the 2nd bombing raid, on April the 25th, a bomb had fallen directly on a gun. That was when they decided the guns were just too vulnerable and had to be moved. The resistance had told the Allies that the guns had been moved, but the Germans had placed wooden beams in place of the guns, so aerial photos showed there were guns. All was not lost for the Rangers. They had a second mission, which was to set up a roadblock to stop German troops coming from Grand Camp towards Omaha Beach, and that they could do. The roadblock was at the road parallel to the coast, about 200 yards from the T-junction towards the Grand Camp. Second Lieutenant Len Lomel and Sergeant Kuhn saw that a lane near the roadblock had tire marks going down it. They followed the track to see where it led. About half a mile down the track, they found the 5 guns set up along a hedge, pointing towards Utah Beach. Strange thing is, there were no troops manning the guns, but they could see a group about 100 yards away talking with their officer. Lomel and Kuhn had 1 thermite grenade each, so they spiked 2 of the guns. Thermite grenades make heat, not noise, so they melted the firing mechanism without alerting the Germans. Then they ran back to the Rangers at the roadblock to get some more thermite. While they were gone, another group of Rangers, led by Sergeant Pinsky, found the guns and had enough thermite to spike them all. They also blew up a pile of charges. So the Rangers did find the guns, and they did disable them. The longest day was filmed at the site, but in the film, they get to the top of the cliffs, find no guns, and the story stops there. The fact that Lomel found the guns unmanned is linked to the reason that the Rangers got up the cliffs relatively quickly. There had been a bombing raid at 5 o'clock by Australian pilots in RAF Lancasters. That bombing raid killed quite a few troops and blocked others in the bunkers, so there were only a few dozen men at the top of the cliffs. The men inland, who should have been manning the 3 guns that were still serviceable, were terrorised by the bombing and found a vat of cider, and they got drunk. They said stuff these guns, and they didn't want to be near them. Having successfully achieved their objectives, their problems weren't over. Losing 40 minutes on the way in had meant they had to climb the cliffs under fire, but had another consequence. Under the normal plan, they would have got to the cliffs by 6:30, captured the battery by 7, and then 500 Rangers of the 5th Ranger Battalion would come in to reinforce them. But as they didn't get to the cliffs till 7:10, the 500 Rangers then went into Omaha Beach. Rudder's men had to defend the battery against counterattacks till the morning of the 8th. 225 men set out from the troop ships. 2 landing craft capsized, leaving 180 to land at the cliffs. There were only 15 casualties going up the cliffs, but on the morning of the 8th, there were just 90 men still bearing arms. That means 135 casualties, but of those 135, 26 had been killed. The plaque on the wall in the fire control bunker has the names of 96 men killed. The inscription says, "On this site and Omaha Beach."
This tank was coming down the road from Omaha Beach, which is that way, towards Pointe du Hoc, and you can identify the place by this building here and the gable behind it. Hasn't changed in 75 years.
The men arriving from Omaha Beach on the 8th were made up of the 29th Division men and Rangers. As they arrived near St. Pierre-du-Mont, a sniper fired from the church spire. A tank put a shell through the tower, which collapsed. There are still mysteries about Pointe du Hoc and a controversy about the usefulness of their action. But if they hadn't disabled the guns that the drunken troops had abandoned, other troops who weren't drunk could have used them to fire on Utah Beach. The attack on Pointe du Hoc was certainly one of the most audacious actions of D-Day.